In this lesson, I talk about the second of 4 tactics used by folks in climate negotiation when they are in the anger, denial, and depression stages of the climate grief cycle. And in this case, I'm talking about the strawman, or oversimplification, exaggeration, and substitution. The lesson objectives are to gain familiarity with the strawman fallacy or tactic as it's applied in climate negotiations, and recognize how it can crop up when we are in climate negotiation, and finally, to develop an understanding what we might do about it when we encounter it. So, what is a strawman argument? The strawman is exchanging an argument for one that is easier to refute. There are 3 basic approaches. Exaggeration. That's taking the argument and inflating it to ridiculous extremes. And then what we find is that the ridiculously exaggerated argument is easy to refute because it is so ridiculous. Simplification is taking the argument in the other direction. So what we do in simplification in a straw man is ignore the nuances of the argument itself. So we simplify it down to the point where it's meaningless. And substitution is actually changing the argument for something completely different altogether. This is a favorite of politicians. You can hear it at press conferences and you can see it in speeches. But what they do is you could, for example, ask them a very complicated question about the state of the economy. And what you get in reply is a long comment about how great it is to be a Canadian. And as I said, this can be subtle, and an adept politician can work this very, very well so that you don't even notice it's happening. Personally, I've been at meetings where we've seen politicians speak, listened to what they had to say, and found myself nodding and agreeing all the way through the thing. Then, driving back to the office afterwards, finding myself saying, "Wait a minute, they didn't answer the question." Now, in climate negotiation, what happens is we take reasonable comments, reasonable concerns, and we see them warped to ridiculous extremes. And then that straw man's easier to shoot down. And as I've said a number of times, it can be very subtle. So it's tempting to accept the straw man at face value and just simply go into a debate about the straw man. But what you find is that you're debating things you didn't say. So you're defending a position that's actually not your position. And ultimately, it's a distraction and a waste of time. Here's an example that we encounter often in climate negotiation. I could say, evidence shows the climate is changing. And in reply, I'm told, "Joel, it's unreasonable to demand that we give up our cars, our homes, and our livelihood. Climate change is ridiculous." So let's think about that example for a moment. This is a case of substitution and exaggeration. You'll note that in my original comment, I didn't mention climate action whatsoever. I didn't say anything about what to do about climate change. I simply said, I think the climate's changing. And the straw man substituted a brand new argument. And it suggested that I'm criticizing morality and lifestyle. It said that I'm talking about ridiculous ways of dealing with climate change. And it reflates all of that to incredible extremes. You'll note that it did not disprove my original statement. But what has happened is the argument has shifted. Now we're talking about the unreasonable demands that I've made, and no longer about the reality of climate change itself. So the straw man is subtle. If we accept that climate is changing, then yeah, absolutely, we should be considering what we should do about it. And to this point, there is no distortion. There is nothing wrong with that particular straw man. But then it paints an exaggerated picture of what that means in terms of economic ruin, shutting down all industry, and how climate action that I didn't even recommend leads to a barren and disease-filled life for all of us in the future. The intent of all of this is to whip up fear and to change the topic. And unfortunately, more often than not, it's successful on both counts. Here's another example. And this is one that I do encounter often inside climate advocacy groups themselves. So I could say something like, adapting to climate change is critical. And then I hear back, but Joel, climate adaptation diverts us from greenhouse gas management, so we shouldn't do it. But you'll note once again, I didn't say anything about greenhouse gas mitigation, said nothing about how to manage greenhouse gas emissions or whether we should or should not do it. My key points were that engineers should build adaptation into their work, because engineers have an obligation to manage predictable and avoidable risk, and climate change results in both. And these risks can lead to injury and death that we have a professional obligation to avoid it best we can. But I also have a core belief that we also have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That is the fundamental, the core risk mitigation activity that we need to take. So here's an example of substitution and exaggeration. So what we've done is we changed my argument from I believe we need to do climate change adaptation to I don't believe in greenhouse gas reduction. And then we argued about how stupid it was that I would say that. But I didn't say any of that. The problem here is that skeptics sometimes promote adaptation instead of mitigation. So what they're arguing is that adaptation supersedes mitigation, and that's more important than dealing with these things. And they would say something to the effect of if the climate's changing, humankind has been infinitely adaptable, we'll adapt to this, there's no problem here. But that's also a straw man. Because humankind adapts when we recognize a problem and take action. But the argument the skeptic is making says we don't need to do either, we'll just somehow miraculously adapt. But the problem within the climate advocacy group is that this leads to bickering and inaction internally, because we're so busy debating with each other about what's more important, mitigation or adaptation, that nothing happens at all. And here's yet another example. I could say, climate change is a serious issue. And I'm told, and I've heard this one a lot, the climate has always been changing. There's nothing new here. We don't need to do anything. Now, the problem with this, and it's partially true, but only in as far as it goes. Because the situation is actually far more complex than the straw man would suggest. So we need to understand climate change in broader terms. We need to fully grasp the concern. Yes, the climate's always been changing, but it's changing more now than it has in the past. And humankind is having an impact that we've never had in the past. So yes, it's been changing in the past, but not in the way it's going right now. So that is an example of oversimplification in the straw man. And I've seen this usually at a later step in the discussion. So this is one that starts to happen when we've been discussing this for a while, we've been negotiating for a while, and people say, well, yeah, I can see maybe the climate is changing. Then they'll say, but it's always been changing and it has nothing to do with me. So it's a way of absolving themselves of any responsibility for the outcomes or for any of the causes. And ultimately, it's a way of avoiding the discussion. So ultimately, they're still not listening. All of this are symptoms of denial phase activities or negotiation tactics. Now, as I've said before, this can morph quickly into depression and anger, and that's why we have to be careful in how we manage it. But the problem is scared and angry people are drawn to ideas that amplify their fear and anger. And that's what we have to watch out for. So they're already scared, they're already angry, and a straw man says, you're right to be scared and angry, and all of these people who are arguing about climate action are wrong, and they're going to cause all these disastrous outcomes. And scared and angry people say, yeah, what he said. So the straw man exploits that tendency. We need to remember that folks are coming to grips with an unpleasant and scary proposition, so they are actually scared. And this may seem like a negotiation, because we're talking back and forth about ideas, and it seems to be that we're actually having a debate. But by changing the topic, we're actually not debating the core issue. We're talking about side issues all around. And it can seem reasonable, but as I said, we need to be careful how we deal with it, because it can slip very quickly into anger and depression. And watch out for trolls, because trolls love straw man arguments, and they use it in two ways. The first is to derail open discussion. What they do is they demand that we defend a warped picture of our own position. And, we tend to fall into the trap, and so we do it. We argue about that position, but it's not actually our position. It's the straw man we're arguing about. So in this way, it can be subtle, and our temptation to fight it, to fight back, argue with the troll, is huge. And the other thing they do with the straw man is use it to stir up fear and anger. Like I said, it can seem really reasonable, and so the average person can buy into this concept that, perhaps there is a conspiracy here. Perhaps they are asking me to do unreasonable things. Perhaps they are being overly zealous in all of this. Perhaps they are panicking. It's easy for them to buy into, especially because they don't want to accept the argument in the first place. And it makes it difficult for us to negotiate with them. I would argue that we need to focus on normal people. The average person is just trying to understand what to do. What does this mean for them? What does it mean for their families? And how should they respond? Now, straw man argument can sound like common sense, as I've said. So it can be stated in a way that makes it seem reasonable to these folks. And then they use the straw man to put off these difficult choices. So we need to focus on these people to show them, we got to help them through this denial stage of the process so that they can move on to take some concrete action for themselves and for their family. So here are some do's and don'ts. As always, open listening, be patient, state your argument clearly, do understand your own position, work your core message and stay on it. And if you find that you're deviating from it, go back to it. And finally, you have to seek common ground. What are our common concerns and how does this all help? The do nots. Do not offer up facts and figures. Do not respond with anger. It's easy to get angry, especially when you catch yourself falling prey to a straw man argument. So this is not the way to convince people that they need to take climate action. And really, really do not argue with the straw man. Simply restate your original position and move back to it. And in this way, we can't allow ourselves to get distracted. So in the fallacies we consider, the common are still common. We still have open listening. We have to be patient. We have to understand our own position, our own core message, and stay on it. Seek common ground. We have added a unique response now in terms of stating and restating your argument clearly. When someone replaces your argument with a straw man, you then move back to the original argument and ignore the straw man and argue your original position. That's the one you prepared to deal with. That's the one you should be dealing with. So what did we cover in this lesson? I talked about the straw man fallacy and how it crops up in climate negotiations and what we should do about it. Feel free to comment below. Let's hear how you have had to deal with the straw man, what you've done about it. Have you used different techniques than I might have suggested? What's worked for you? What's not worked for you? Share those comments. I'll review them, share them with the rest of the participants of the course, and we'll carry on with the discussion.